When's the wedding? I asked. We already got married, Mom, she said. We only invited people who really matter. Just send the beach house keys and stop being so dramatic. I smiled and hung up. 2 days later, I left a wedding gift at their front door, one that made her new husband scream so loud the neighbors called the cops. If you're watching this, hit subscribe and tell me where you're tuning in from, because you're about to hear how sweet revenge really sounds. This isn't just a story about a spoiled daughter or a selfish son-in-law. It's about what happens when a mother's love is betrayed and how silence can become the sharpest weapon of all. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Ellen Smith. Most people call me Ellen. And at 62 years old, I thought I had already lived through every kind of heartbreak a woman could face. Turns out, I was wrong.
The first time I met Trevor, he didn't shake my hand. He just nodded, like I was the maid answering the door instead of the woman who raised the girl standing next to him. Madison, my only daughter, was glowing that day. She'd always been beautiful, soft blonde curls, bright green eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. But that day, her glow felt forced, too perfect, like she was trying to prove something. "Mom, this is Trevor," she said, clutching his arm tightly. He didn't even look up from his phone. "Hey." That was it. One word. No warmth, no respect. Just, hey. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But the way he kept his arm around her waist, too tight, too possessive, made my stomach twist. Still, I cooked for them, made coffee, tried to start small talk. Every question I asked, Trevor answered for her. "How's work, Maddie?" I asked. "She's fine. She might quit soon. I told her she doesn't need to stress about that stuff anymore." Madison laughed nervously, eyes flicking toward him before meeting mine. I saw it. The silent plea. The, "Don't make this worse, Mom." I changed the subject. We talked about the weather. My heart sank the whole time. That night, after they left, I stood at the sink washing dishes, staring out at the beach behind my house. The same house I'd bought after her father died, the same one where Madison had taken her first steps. I whispered to the empty kitchen, "What are you doing, baby?" Over the next few months, I saw less and less of her. Calls went unanswered, messages left on read. When I finally got her on the phone, she'd sound rushed. "Sorry, Mom, Trevor's waiting. I'll call you later." Later never came. Birthdays passed. Holidays, too. She didn't even visit that Christmas, said they had plans. It was the first Christmas morning I'd spent alone in 25 years. I made her favorite cinnamon rolls anyway. They stayed untouched on the counter until they went hard as stone. Then, one afternoon in spring, she showed up at my door out of nowhere. "Mom," she said, acting like nothing was wrong. Behind her, Trevor stood with his hands in his pockets, scanning my house like he was calculating its worth. They stayed for coffee again. This time, Trevor did all the talking. About his new job, their future investments, his plans to upgrade their lifestyle. Madison just smiled and nodded like a background prop. When she went to the bathroom, he leaned back in his chair and said, "So about that beach house?" I froze. "What about it?" He smirked. "Maddie said you'd probably let us use it for a while. Honeymoon spot. You know, family discount." I kept my tone calm. "Well, I haven't decided," he laughed. "You mean you haven't realized you don't need it anymore?" The nerve of him. The arrogance. Madison came back into the room and the tension vanished. On the surface, anyway.
but under the table, my fists clenched so hard, my nails bit into my palms. When they left, she hugged me quickly. Her perfume lingered, but her warmth didn't. I watched them drive away and told myself I'd lost her. Weeks later, I found out how right I was. A neighbor called me one evening, said she saw a beautiful wedding on social media. Madison's wedding. I thought she was mistaken, but when I opened my phone, my hands started shaking. There it was, Madison in a white dress, smiling beside Trevor under a canopy of roses. The caption read, "The happiest day of our lives, surrounded by those who truly matter. No mother, no family, just his friends, his relatives, strangers to me. They hadn't just left me out, they'd erased me. I sat there for hours scrolling through pictures, each one cutting deeper. Her in my grandmother's pearls, pearls I'd given her years ago and told her to wear on your special day. Her walking down the aisle on the arm of Trevor's father. And then, the final insult, a photo of my beach house in the background of their honeymoon announcement. Can't wait to spend our first week as husband and wife at this beautiful beach house. They hadn't even asked. They just took. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through every room of my home, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories. Every inch of it was built with love, sacrifice, and grief. It was the one place I still felt close to her father, to the family we once were. And now, it was being handed to a man who saw me as an obstacle, and a daughter who saw me as a burden. By sunrise, I knew what I was going to do. It wasn't anger anymore. It was resolve. Cold, clear, steady. They wanted the beach house? They could have it, but not the way they expected. The next morning, I went into town, bought some supplies, called a locksmith, then I made some arrangements, quiet ones. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to beg. All I needed was patience. Because revenge, I realized, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits, smiling. And when it strikes, it leaves scars that never fade.
2 days after seeing those wedding photos, the first message came through. "Hey, Mom," Madison texted. "Just wanted to ask if the beach house is ready for us next week. Trevor says he'll need the keys early to get it cleaned up. Thanks, heart." No apology. No mention of the wedding. Just entitlement, wrapped in emojis. I stared at that text for a long time, long enough for my coffee to go cold. Then, with steady hands, I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. I'll make sure everything's ready." And I meant it. Because when betrayal comes dressed as sweetness, you don't fight it with anger. You let it walk right into your plan. That afternoon, I drove to the beach house. The same one her father and I bought 40 years ago when life still had laughter in it. The air smelled like salt and memories. The walls were lined with old photos. Madison at 5, chasing seagulls. Me and her dad on the porch swing, sunburned but smiling. For a long while, I stood there, breathing it in, memorizing everything. Then, I started removing things. Every framed picture of Madison, gone. Every reminder of family warmth, packed into boxes and stored in the attic. The house looked sterile, almost hollow, exactly how I felt. Then I replaced a few things, subtle but deliberate. The framed photo above the fireplace, once a family portrait, now replaced with a painting her father made years ago, depicting a stormy sea swallowing a ship whole. The inscription on the bottom read, "Beware of calm waters, they hide deep storms." Perfect. The next day, Trevor showed up at my door unannounced. He always had that habit, appearing like he owned every space he walked into. "Hey, Ellen," he said, leaning against my doorframe. "Thought I'd swing by and grab those keys." Of course, I said with a polite smile. Come in. He followed me inside, his eyes darting around the house like a predator scanning prey. You've got a nice setup here, he said. Maddie told me you live alone. Must be quiet. It is. Sometimes too quiet. He chuckled. Well, once we start staying at the beach house, you'll have company more often. I handed him the keys, a little silver ring with a seashell charm I'd added years ago. He twirled them on his finger, grinning like he'd just won something. He had no idea. Oh, I added casually, I should warn you, the back gate is a bit tricky, and the alarm system, well, it's temperamental. Don't try to reset it yourself. He smirked. Don't worry, I'm good with tech. I smiled sweetly. I'm sure you are. As soon as he left, I picked up the phone and made another call to someone who'd been waiting for my message, a man named Richard Blake, private investigator, friend of my late husband. Richard, I said, it's time. For weeks before the wedding, I'd had a nagging feeling. Madison had changed too fast, too completely. So, quietly, I'd asked Richard to dig a little. And what he'd found still made my stomach turn. Trevor wasn't some self-made entrepreneur like he claimed. He was knee-deep in debt, had 2 failed business ventures, one of which was currently under investigation for fraud. He'd also been engaged twice before, both women, older, wealthier, both left nearly bankrupt. And now he'd found Madison, sweet, trusting Madison, whose late father's inheritance had finally matured that year, a 7-figure inheritance. That's what this marriage was about. Not love, not family, just money. I went down to the basement that evening and pulled out an old storage box labeled Mark's Tools, my late husband's things. Inside were blueprints, locks, a few electrical parts, and the old security system manuals. I smiled. They wanted the beach house, they'd get it. But I was going to make sure it was unforgettable. The week passed quickly. Madison texted occasionally, cheerful, distant messages that felt robotic. Then came Saturday. Heading to the beach house today. So excited, heart. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat on my porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the sky turn orange with sunset. I could almost hear my husband's voice beside me. Let them dig their own hole, Ellie. You just hand them the shovel. Late that night, my phone rang. It was Madison. Mom, she whispered, her voice trembling. The alarm keeps going off. Trevor says the lights won't stop flickering. Can you tell us how to fix it? I paused for effect. Oh, that old system. It's motion sensitive. Maybe the house is just reacting. What do you mean reacting? She asked nervously. Well, I said slowly, the sensors were designed to detect when something feels wrong, when someone's in the house who doesn't belong. Mom, that's not funny. Oh, sweetheart, I'm not joking. And then I hung up. The truth is, I hadn't done anything dangerous, just clever. The motion sensors were connected to an old smart system that triggered the alarm whenever new devices connected to the Wi-Fi. Every time Trevor's phone or laptop tried to sync, the system went haywire. Lights flashing, alarms blaring, speakers echoing with faint recorded sounds of waves crashing and whispers. Just enough to get under his skin. By the next morning, Madison texted again. Mom, we can't stay here. The house feels weird. Trevor thinks it's haunted. Can we come to your place for a few days? I stared at that message for a full minute, then replied, Of course, sweetheart. My door's always open. They arrived that afternoon, exhausted, irritable, clearly shaken. Madison looked pale, mascara smudged, while Trevor's fake confidence had cracked.
He refused to meet my eyes. "Oh, you poor things," I said, ushering them in. "You look like you've seen ghosts." She shot Trevor a glare. "I told you we shouldn't mess with the breaker." He muttered something under his breath and disappeared into the guest room. As soon as he was gone, Madison slumped into a chair and burst into tears. "Mom, I'm sorry. I know how everything looks. The wedding, the house. I didn't want drama. Trevor said you'd make it about yourself, that you'd embarrass me." I stayed silent. Let her speak. "He told me you said you didn't want to come, that you hated him." Her voice cracked. "I thought you didn't care anymore." I wanted to reach out, to comfort her. But I didn't. Not yet. Because I could see it now. The manipulation, the wedge he'd driven between us, and the pain he'd used to control her. I said softly, "People can tell you anything, Madison, but actions, those always show the truth." She wiped her eyes. "You're right." That night, I didn't sleep much. I could hear them arguing in the guest room, muffled, angry voices through thin walls, and at one point, I heard something crash. Then silence. By morning, Trevor was gone. His car, his bags, everything. Madison sat at the kitchen table, red-eyed and shaking. "He left," she whispered. "He said I was crazy, that this family's cursed." I poured her a cup of coffee and said, "Good," simply. Then the curse worked. She blinked, confused. "What?" I smiled. "You'll understand soon." But that wasn't the end. Because what Madison didn't know yet, what Trevor had just discovered, was that the wedding gift I'd left on their doorstep wasn't just symbolic. It was evidence. Real, legal evidence of his fraud. Quietly handed to the police by a mother who'd had enough. And within 24 hours, he wouldn't just be gone. He'd be in handcuffs.
Madison sat at my kitchen table for hours that morning, staring into her coffee like it might hold the answer she didn't want to say out loud. The sun came through the lace curtains, falling across her face, the same freckled cheeks I used to kiss goodnight when she was a little girl. Now she looked smaller somehow, fragile, like the woman who'd come home wasn't my daughter at all, but a stranger wearing her face. "Mom," she whispered finally, "did you know about Trevor?" I didn't answer right away. I set another cup down in front of her, steaming hot, and took a slow breath. I knew enough. Her eyes filled with tears. "He took everything. My cards, my savings, even my inheritance fund. It's all in his name now. I trusted him, Mom. I really thought—" I stopped her with a gentle touch on the hand. "He's not the first man to mistake love for a bank account, sweetheart. But he will be the last one to mistake you for a fool." She blinked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "this isn't over." For 2 days, she barely left the guest room. I heard her crying through the walls, muttering apologies to ghosts that didn't need them. I let her. Sometimes you have to let someone fall apart before you can help them rebuild. I spent that time on the phone. Quiet calls, careful words. Richard, the private investigator, had already delivered everything to the authorities. Fraudulent bank transfers, fake business registrations, screenshots of Trevor's messages to other women. It was all airtight. By the third morning, there was a knock on the door. 2 officers stood there. One of them held a folder in his hands. "Mrs. Smith?" he asked. "Yes." "I believe this belongs to your daughter." Inside the folder were copies of documents. Her inheritance account reinstated, the fraud complaint filed, and Trevor's pending arrest warrant.
He'd tried to flee the state that morning, didn't make it past the highway checkpoint. Madison's face went pale when I told her. "He's in jail?" she asked. I nodded. "For now. The evidence was clear. You're safe." She started crying again, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was the cry of someone who finally understood they weren't powerless anymore. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat alone on the porch with a glass of wine, listening to the waves crash against the rocks. There's something about the ocean at night. It doesn't whisper, it warns. Every sound feels like a reminder. Tides turn, storms come, and nothing that washes up from betrayal ever looks the same afterward. I looked toward the beach house in the distance. Lights still flickered from inside. It wasn't ghosts. It was the alarm, the one that I'd never actually turned off. It was still waiting. For me. The next morning, I drove back there for the first time. The gate creaked open, and for the first time in weeks, I stepped into the house that used to hold joy. The air smelled of damp salt and perfume. Her perfume. There were wedding petals still scattered across the porch from the photos they'd taken here. A cruel reminder of how easily love had been replaced with lies. I walked room to room, checking the spaces that once echoed with laughter. The master bedroom, untouched. The kitchen, spotless. But when I reached the living room, I found something strange. A small velvet box on the table, left open. Inside, a ring. Not Madison's wedding ring. Another one, simpler, engraved inside with the words, "Forever comes at a price." My heart tightened. Trevor had probably left it there, some twisted little trophy. But as I held it, something inside me shifted. The anger I'd been carrying, the kind that burns quietly and eats at your ribs, it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like purpose. That night, I cooked Madison's favorite dinner, roasted chicken, garlic potatoes, and peach cobbler. She came out of her room looking lost, like she didn't quite know how to exist outside of the chaos he'd left behind. We ate mostly in silence, until she finally said, "Mom, I don't understand. How did I not see it? How did I let him do this to me?" I looked at her, my only child, who once believed love meant saying yes to everything. And I said softly, "Because you thought love was supposed to hurt. But it isn't. It never was." She looked down. "I just wanted to be loved." "And you are," I said, my voice breaking for the first time in years. "You always were. Even when you forgot where home was." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time she smiled through them. It was small, tentative, but real. The following week, she went to stay with a friend while she sorted through the legal mess. I told her I'd handle the beach house cleanup. She didn't question it. She knew better now. When I said I'd handle something, I meant it. And handle it, I did. I called Richard one last time. "You still got that contact in the media?" he said cautiously. "You sure you want to go public?" I smiled. "It's not about publicity. It's about truth." Within days, Trevor's arrest hit the local papers. Businessmen arrested for fraudulent bank fraud after secret wedding. Underneath the headline, there was a photo, Madison's wedding photo, the same one that had once made me sick to my stomach. Now it looked poetic. The caption read, "Wife cooperated in investigation, recovering stolen assets." For the first time, my daughter wasn't the victim of his schemes. She was the survivor. That night, she called me again. Her voice was shaky, but lighter somehow. "Mom, they said he might serve 5 years, maybe more." I said. Good. That's enough time for him to think about what forever really means. We both laughed then, quietly, but genuinely. It was the first time laughter had filled my house in a long time. Before hanging up, she said, Mom, thank you for everything. I didn't need to say you're welcome. She knew. But after I hung up, I sat there staring at the ocean again, thinking of all the ways betrayal leaves marks that never quite wash off. And I realized something. It wasn't Trevor who broke me. It wasn't even Madison's choices. It was the silence. All those months I'd said nothing, done nothing, when deep down I knew what was happening. That was the real breaking point. Not the wedding, not the lies, but the moment I stopped believing I had a voice. Now, that silence was gone. The next morning, I drove back to the beach house one final time. I brought flowers, white lilies, my husband's favorite, and placed them on the porch railing right under the window where our family used to watch sunsets together. Then, I took a small envelope from my bag. Inside it was a note addressed to Madison. I left it on the kitchen table where she'd find it someday. It read, My darling girl, this house has seen every version of our family. Love, loss, and forgiveness. Let it remind you of who you are, not who you tried to please. Never hand over your peace again, not for love, not for promises. You are stronger than what hurt you. Mom.
I locked the door behind me and walked away, barefoot on the sand. The tide was coming in, washing over my footprints, and for the first time in years, I didn't look back.
There's something about justice that doesn't need to announce itself. It just arrives. Steady, deliberate, unstoppable. For weeks, I watched the pieces fall into place like a puzzle I'd been working on for years. Trevor behind bars, Madison starting therapy, the media slowly peeling back layers of his deception. But there was one last thing left undone. The final act that would make everything complete. You see, Trevor's downfall wasn't just about fraud or lies. It was about humiliation. He'd built his entire identity on appearances. The perfect husband, the successful businessman, the man who rescued a girl from her overbearing mother. He needed the world to believe that story. So I decided to rewrite it for him, publicly, permanently. I contacted an old friend of mine, Julia Harper, a journalist who had once interviewed my husband years ago for his architecture firm. Julia owed me a favor, and more importantly, she understood discretion. When I called, she didn't even hesitate. Ellen, I read about that case. Tell me what you need. I took a deep breath. I want people to know who he really is. Not just a con man, but a predator who destroys families. Julia's tone softened. You have proof? Oh, I said, glancing at the thick folder on my desk. I have more than proof. I have history. She met me that afternoon. We sat in the corner of a quiet cafe overlooking the water. I slid the folder across the table. Emails, bank statements, fake IDs, old text messages between Trevor and his former fiancée. Julia's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. Ellen, this is huge. You realize this could ruin him forever. I smiled, calm and measured. That's the point. The article went live a week later. Front page of the local paper. The man behind the mask. How one woman's evidence exposed a serial con artist. It spread like wildfire. Online forums picked it up, news outlets reprinted it, and for the first time, Trevor's name wasn't followed by businessman, it was followed by fraudster, scammer, serial manipulator. His face was everywhere, not in wedding photos this time, but in mugshots. Every lie he'd ever told turned into ink on a page, a permanent stain he couldn't wash off. Madison called me the day it went viral. Mom, she whispered, half in disbelief, half in awe. "You did this, didn't you?" I didn't lie. "I did," I said softly. "For you. For me. For every woman who's ever been made to feel like her kindness was a weakness." She was silent for a long time. Then finally she said, "Thank you." Not the kind of thank you people say when they're relieved, the kind that comes when they realize someone fought for them long after they stopped fighting for themselves. But revenge, real revenge, it's not just about exposing someone. It's about reclaiming what they took from you. Your peace, your dignity, your power. So I took the next step. I called my lawyer and had the beach house legally transferred into a trust, one that Madison couldn't sell or give away. The deed now carried a clause: it would always remain in the family name. If she ever tried to sign it over, it would revert back to me automatically. When she found out, she came to see me in person. The first time in months, she'd stepped foot in my home without hesitation. "Mom," she said, smiling through tears, "you didn't have to do that." "I did," I said, "because this house doesn't just hold your memories, it holds your lessons." She looked around, at the framed photos I'd put back up, at the smell of her favorite candles returning to the air. She said, "It feels different here now." She said, "It feels different here now." She said, "It feels different here now," quietly. "It's supposed to," I told her. "We burned out the rot." A week later, I got another call, this time from Richard, the investigator. "You'll want to see this." He said, "Local TV just aired a segment on the story. They're calling it the Beach House Betrayal." I turned on the television. There it was. Aerial shots of the house, the beach, old wedding photos fading into the headline. And then the anchor said something that made me stop cold. Sources say the whistleblower in this case was the victim's mother, Ellen Smith, whose quiet courage brought the truth to light. My name. Out loud. Broadcast for everyone to hear. For a long time, I sat there listening to it echo in the room. Not with shame, not with fear, but with peace. Because sometimes revenge doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers your name, and the world listens. That night, Madison came over for dinner again. She'd cut her hair short, something she'd wanted to do for years, but Trevor never let her. It made her look younger, freer, herself. We sat by the fireplace, talking like we hadn't in ages. No walls, no secrets, just mother and daughter finally breathing the same air again. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You know, I used to think revenge was ugly, but now I see it's not about hurting someone, it's about taking back what's yours." I smiled. "Exactly. It's not destruction, sweetheart. It's restoration." A few days later, I got another letter from Trevor's attorney, an official notice that his bail had been denied. He'd tried to plea bargain, but the evidence was too solid. He was staying right where he belonged. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and went about my day. Because my revenge was already complete. Not when he was arrested, not when his name hit the papers, but when my daughter finally looked at me with love instead of resentment. That was the victory. One evening, I stood on the beach, the wind tugging at my hair, the sky painted pink with sunset. Madison was beside me, barefoot in the sand. She glanced at the water and said, "Dad would be proud of you." I smiled, my eyes stinging a little. "Maybe, but I think he'd be prouder of you." She looked at me. "For what?" "For remembering where home is." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in years, everything felt whole again. The tide washed over our feet, cool and forgiving, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered, mostly to myself, "Justice served, peace restored." But life, I've learned, doesn't end neatly. Justice isn't always tidy. A week later, I received one last thing in the mail. No return address. Inside was a small envelope with a single photo. Me and Madison standing on the beach, taken from a distance. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "You win, for now." I stared at it, my heart steady. Trevor had sent it, no doubt. A final attempt to rattle me from wherever he was sitting behind bars. But I only smiled. Because that's the thing about men like him. They never understand that the game is already over. He'd lost the moment I stopped being silent. I burned the photo in the fireplace that night, watching the edges curl and fade to ash. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and whispered, "Rest easy, Mark. It's done."
They say revenge tastes best when it's cold, but they're wrong. It's not cold at all. It's warm, like the first sunrise after a long, endless storm. It had been 3 months since Trevor's arrest. The house no longer felt haunted. The laughter that had once been fake was gone, replaced by something gentler, quieter. Madison came by every Sunday now. She brought fresh flowers, cooked dinner, and talked about small, simple things. For a woman who once measured love by grand gestures and expensive things, she had finally discovered peace in ordinary moments. And me, I had learned something too, that silence, when used right, can be louder than rage. One morning, I woke up to the sound of waves crashing harder than usual. The beach was rough that day, the tide swollen and alive. I stood on the porch watching the horizon shift and realized the storm that had wrecked my family had finally passed. But closure doesn't arrive like a letter. It sneaks in, quiet and unannounced. That same afternoon, I got a message from Julia, the journalist. "Turn on Channel 9, it said. I did, and there it was. Trevor's sentencing. He looked thinner, paler, still trying to smirk for the cameras, still pretending to be in control, but the judge's words cut through everything. "Mr. Trevor Langford, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in state prison for fraud, coercion, and identity theft." The courtroom erupted, murmurs, gasps, flashes from reporters, and there, in the middle of it all, Trevor's composure cracked. He looked straight into the camera, maybe thinking I was watching. And I was. I leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Goodbye, Trevor." The screen went black, and just like that, it was over. That night, Madison came over with a small box in her hands. "What's that?" I asked. She smiled, a peace offering. Inside was a framed picture, our family, taken years ago at the same beach house, before all the lies, before the distance. "I found it in one of my old boxes," she said softly. "I think it belongs here." For a long moment, I just stared at it. My husband's arm around me, Madison laughing, the sea behind us, frozen in a time when love was simple and whole. I hung the photo on the wall beside the window that overlooked the shore, right where the light hit it in the morning. Madison watched me, then whispered, "You know, I used to hate this house." I turned to her, and now? She smiled faintly. "Now I understand it wasn't the house I hated, it was the person I became inside it." I reached out, brushing her cheek gently. "Then let's make new memories here. Better ones." She nodded. "Together." The following week, I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years, not for anyone else, just for me. Stories about women who had been underestimated, silenced, dismissed, and who found ways to rise without ever shouting. Each page felt like a quiet act of rebellion, each word a step toward healing.
Madison began helping too. She'd read my drafts, offer thoughts, even suggest titles. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch, sipping tea, watching the waves roll in. It felt like redemption, not just for her, but for both of us. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. From Trevor. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. His handwriting was shaky, almost unrecognizable. It read, "Ellen, I've lost everything, but I want you to know I did love her, in my own way. Maybe I never deserved her, maybe I never deserved you forgiving her, but I'll never forget how calm you looked that day I was taken away, like you'd known this was coming all along. You always were the smarter one. Trevor." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I walked down to the beach, dug a small hole in the sand, and buried it. The tide would take it eventually, washing away the last piece of a story that no longer belonged to me. I didn't need his remorse. I'd already written my own ending. A few days later, I got an invitation from the local women's center. They'd read Julia's article and wanted me to speak at a fundraiser about finding strength after betrayal. First, I hesitated. I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't looking for attention. But Madison said something that made me reconsider. "Mom, your silence saved me, but your voice might save someone else." She was right. So I went. The night of the event, I stood on stage, facing a room full of women, some smiling, some holding back tears, all carrying invisible scars. And for the first time, I told the story, my story, from the beginning. The daughter who betrayed me, the man who deceived her, the revenge that wasn't about vengeance at all, but about freedom. When I finished, the room was silent. Then applause, soft at first, then swelling. I didn't cry. I just smiled, because I could finally feel it, the weight lifting, the air clearing. Afterwards, a woman approached me. "Your story," she said, voice trembling. "I thought I was alone in mine, but you gave me hope." I took her hands in mine. "You're never alone. You just haven't found your voice yet." As I walked out into the cool night air, the moon hung low over the ocean, and I thought about how far I'd come from being the mother left out of her own daughter's wedding to being the woman who rewrote the ending. The next morning, Madison surprised me again. She'd booked a small weekend trip for us, just the two of us. Not a honeymoon, she said, laughing, just a new beginning. We spent the weekend walking barefoot on new sands, cooking together, even dancing in the kitchen. No pretense, no lies, just laughter. On the last night, she looked at me and said, "Mom, I don't think you realize something." "What's that?" "You didn't just take revenge. You took your power back and gave me mine." Her words sank deep, soft and steady, like the tide rolling in. I smiled. Maybe that's what real revenge is. Not destruction, but restoration. When we came back home, I stood once more on my porch, watching the sunrise pour gold over the waves. The same sea that had once mirrored my pain now shimmered with peace. I thought of my husband, of Madison, of every woman who's ever been betrayed and told just to move on. And I whispered into the wind, "We don't move on. We rise." As I turned to go back inside, the camera on my porch light blinked once, recording the moment. And I thought maybe someday when Madison's daughter stands here, she'll know what strength looks like. Not a clenched fist, but an open hand, steady, certain, unshaken. Because revenge doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. And that's how my story ends. Not with fire, but with peace.